Hello, everybody. This is episode 22 of Foreign Object, and as always, I'm your host, CJ Werleman. As common as it is to read the old chestnut, good journalism speaks truth to power, it is conversely rare to actually read good journalism. In today's corporate-owned world, where corporate media parrots our corporate-owned politicians, those who benefit most from existing power structures remain unchallenged. My journalism has always been built around a simple question. Is what I'm about to write an exercise in punching down or punching up? If the answer is the former, I immediately stop writing and then question my existing prejudices. Recently, legendary UK street artist Banksy snuck into Gaza to bring attention to what the corporate-controlled media won't tell you. On one bombed-out building, Banksy wrote, quote, "If we wash our hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless, we side with the powerful. We don't remain neutral." This is the prism through which we must see the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The US media not only likes to ascribe equal amounts of moral blame to all sides, it also pretends this conflict is rooted in religion. This is bullshit. Both assertions are ridiculous. One man who does not cower to special interests impose neutrality is my next guest. Max Blumenthal is a balls-to-the-wall journalist. At the risk of embarrassing him, I rate Max as arguably the leading authority on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. His best-selling Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel is a 420-page expose of Israel's drift to the far, far right and its unembarrassed clutch for apartheid and fascism. Most of all, I've invited Max on the Foreign Object for one self-serving reason. I want to make myself feel a little better. Why? In this country, Max is even hated more than me. So Max, welcome to Foreign Object, mate.
Well, keep on trying, keep on dreaming.
Exactly. Mate, so first question, why do conservatives, neocons, neo-atheists, Christian evangelicals believe you're such an asshole? And why are you such a self-loathing Jew?
Well, I always quote Woody Allen, or was it Larry David, who said that I am self-hating, but being Jewish has nothing to do with it. I think it is good to be a little bit self-hating. We have to reflect on ourselves and where we come from, and reflect on our privileges that we have. And so if I'm a white Jewish American, then I am going to be critical of all of those factors if I'm born into some level of privilege. And I think, starting from there, people who are trying to protect their privilege and protect institutional privilege, the greatest incarnation of which is the Jewish state, which is founded on a model of protecting ethnic and religious privilege and maintaining systematic discrimination against an indigenous people. For criticizing those structures, I think I've engendered a lot of hatred. And the people who are obsessing over me these days have an ideology that is what I think would be abhorrent to most Americans, and is abhorrent, I think, to most people in the world if it were sufficiently interrogated and exposed. And that's what I've been doing. So obviously, it's threatening, and they have no real response. They can't respond on the merits of my arguments. They can't debate. What they can do is attempt to create kind of a caricature of me and to take it apart.
Mate, and what I like, which is what you do, and one of my North Stars is what Chomsky wrote, and it's very easy to criticize the violence and the atrocities of somebody else over there, but it takes more honesty to criticize the violence and the oppression carried out in your own name, and that is what you're at the end of the day responsible for. You're a Jewish American, and you commentate and you criticize atrocities which are carried out in not only Israel's name but America's name. And you've done that eloquently with your criticisms of American Sniper, which I believe Fox News, Elizabeth Hasselbeck called. I forget what she called you?
Well, Riley called me a far left kook, and I was given all this credit for leading this campaign that nearly destroyed the film or something. Or Riley had some young journalist on from the National Review who gave me all this credit, but all I did was tweet 2 or 3 things about American Sniper, and Fox and Friends went wild. I mean, these people they have this sense of inviolability. And when you puncture it and criticize someone who, just because they wore the uniform of an American soldier, doesn't mean that they're above scrutiny or above accountability. I mean, this guy's a pathological liar, and someone who was boastful about committing war crimes. And if not only that, but he attempted to kosher an invasion of a country that has led to unparalleled bloodshed. So I thought, I could tweet a few things that criticize this character and call him an American psycho, which is what he is. I mean, Chris Kyle boasted that he climbed the New Orleans Superdome and shot 20 black looters during Hurricane Katrina, which is not only, insane, it's completely false. He didn't do that. And Fox and Friends just went insane, and within a few hours, the kind of, bowels of white America had exploded into my Twitter interactions. So, I mean, it's not hard to really, once you start rolling, they start hating you. It's really not hard to sustain the hatred of a coalition of reactionary and right-wing groups who thrive off of the mobilization of resentment.
Yeah, and it's just, it's how complicit, the state, and also even with Hollywood in constructing these narratives of Chris Kyle. And I mean, his make-believe story of, killing black people in New Orleans. I mean, that was a story that you would read in alternative media sites here and there online, but certainly something that wasn't reported on CNN or Fox, definitely not on Fox News or mainstream television. I mean, those aspects of his, fictitious biography went unchecked.
I think what we've been able to do in online media and on social media is to interrogate and investigate the backgrounds of people who are revered in mainstream media and show them to be complete frauds. And that's what I did this week with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I know you've done that with several Islamophobes. And when you see them interviewed, even after you've exposed them, I mean, my piece in Alternet on Ayaan Hirsi Ali was read by over 100,000 people in 2 days, or it got over 100,000 views in 2 days. Then you see her on Fareed Zakaria, and you see her on BBC and other networks, and they never ask her about her extreme statements, calling Islam a death cult, calling to crush Islam, defending the mass murderer Anders Breivik. They never hold these people accountable. And Chris Kyle's supporters, Clint Eastwood and Bradley Cooper, they were never held accountable for not only for these lies, but for the campaign of incitement against Arab Americans and Muslims that their film spawned. So I mean, what we're exposing goes beyond, a bunch of right wingers. We're exposing an entire media culture that is completely dead, that's a zombie, and that's incapable of holding power accountable.
I mean, I sometimes, question, am I losing my mind? I mean, yourself, Glenn Greenwald, and myself have become the target of Neil Ferguson's rage over our criticism of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And we've specifically, I've read what Glenn has written about her, I've read what you've written about her, and I know exactly what I've written about her, and we're exclusively focusing on the fact that she urged for a military war against Islam. Her defenders say, oh, well, military war, that's just, it's just what she means in an ideological sense. Well, how do you campaign a military war against an ideology? You have to kill the people who hold on to that ideology. That's what we did with the Nazis. And then we criticize her over urging for a Nobel Peace Prize for Benjamin Netanyahu, who waged a slaughter of Gaza civilians. And you couple that with her call for genocide against, a military war against Islam, with praising a genocide, and you put the two together, and then her expression of sympathy for Anders Breivik. And then I look at all this hostility that comes back at you, me, and Glenn, and I go, are we completely illiterate? Are we unable to process what she's saying? I mean, help me out here. Are we missing something?
Yeah, I mean, I quoted Ayaan Hirsi Ali declaring on The Daily Show that 70% of global conflict casualties are caused by Muslims. She said Muslims are responsible for 70% of the death in the world, or 70% of the war fatalities in the world. I mean, she's holding Muslims directly responsible for that. And that stung her. And so she took to this, she somehow was kind of delivered to this pro-Israel campus right-wing troll named Daniel Mail, and she told him that nerves and fatigue were to account for her blaming Muslims for most of the deaths in the world, which is ridiculous. But for once, someone had held her accountable because Jon Stewart didn't do so. Jon Stewart didn't say, "Where did you get that statistic from? That's absurd. How can you back that up?" So they, as I said, they have a sense of inviolability, and when you puncture it, they freak out. But there's more to it than that. It's that the narrative that Ayaan Hirsi Ali tells to Americans, and the narrative that you see in American Sniper, is very comforting to Americans. It tells them that they're good, that they're inherently good, that they're peaceful, that all these wars that they've been involved in have been forced upon them, and that their hands are clean, that they're in a religious conflict with no political roots, that requires no nuanced discussion or historical context, that colonialism never happened, that lies about WMD never happened, that the genocide of Native Americans never happened, that all of this is these are just liberal lies or left-wing lies. And we need to just look at this conflict clearly, and they speak a clear, comforting language, and we're interrupting that narrative.
Exactly. I mean, you've spoken about this really well, and I think it was just in one of your recent speeches. It's this urge of the West to frame all of this as a religious conflict, and you make it clearly. If you look at Israel-Palestine, that conflict has nothing to do with religion, despite Netanyahu's best attempts, despite George Bush or America's best attempts to frame it that way. This is an occupation, and you gave the example, if China colonized and occupied Palestine, Palestinians would be anti-Sino.
Right.
I mean, so speak to how, this narrative has been seeped into the American conscience. And in your book, Goliath, you talk about Netanyahu being the salesman. So speak to that a bit, how he's hijacked that narrative.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Palestinians are not exclusively Muslim. Those who were involved in the Arab Revolt in the 1930s against Zionism and British colonialism in historic Palestine were Christian. There were communists involved, Palestinian communists involved in the Arab Revolt. There were Islamists. There were semi-practicing Muslims. But Palestine has always been diverse, and the Palestinian national struggle has not been structured around religion. And the early wave of Zionism was kind of a secular, based around a messianic ideology. So it's always been about settler colonialism, and that's something that I think that the defenders of Israel don't want most Americans to know, because if they would consider that this is a settler colonial entity, then it seems anachronistic. The U.S. committed a genocide against Native Americans in order to consolidate itself in its late settler colonial phase. Israel is still actively colonizing Palestinians, and it's just something that's abhorrent to most people. So it's better to change the subject and make this about religion. Make it about Hamas, which Netanyahu equates with ISIS, versus a country that's simultaneously democratic but also which represents Judeo-Christian values. So when you look at the campaign of Islamophobia in the United States, there's no way you can divorce it from Israel or Zionism. It's a direct exponent of Zionist public relations in the United States. And you've seen Israeli consulates actually host virulent Islamophobic figures. For example, the LA consulate of the Israeli government hosted Bridget Gabriel. There was a op-ed today in the Daily Californian, which is a student paper at UC Berkeley, calling for targeting student supporters of Palestinian rights. That was the headline. And it was published by David Horowitz, who's not only a major supporter of Netanyahu's Israel and the Likud party, but is also his foundation, the David Horowitz Freedom Center, serves as a funding channel to the outfits of Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer, who are two of the world's leading Islamophobes. And that funding doesn't come directly from David Horowitz. It comes from pro-Israel sources like Nina Rosenwald and Aubrey Chernick.
What about Sheldon Adelson?
Well, and Adelson isn't directly funding Islamophobic outfits. He's funding, a lot of the operations around Netanyahu. I believe that he's funding the Washington Free Beacon. I've heard this from sources around the Free Beacon, and you can just take a look at their website. They're constantly doing PR for Sheldon Adelson. Mm-hmm. And the Free Beacon is definitely an Islamophobic, one of the premier online outlets of Islamophobia. But the point is that by injecting this narrative about Muslims being endemically violent, being a fifth column, which is actually sort of an inherently anti-Semitic argument, or it bears echoes of the kind of propaganda used against Jews in turn-of-the-century Europe. But by doing that, you change the subject from settler colonialism to religious conflict. It becomes much more comforting to Americans to support a country that they see as democratic, as Western, and as a kind of Fort Apache on the front lines of this clash of civilizations. And that's really the last, I think, public relations stand of Israel. And it's why Netanyahu, it's part of his appeal to the Israeli public, is that he can speak to the world and convince the world that Israel is right. He's always done that since early on in his career. He first appeared in the kind of American consciousness during the first Gulf War, when he was constantly on CNN, right at the dawn of 24-hour news. And he would take the opportunity, without any challenge from any Palestinian spokesman or any critic of the war, to paint Saddam Hussein, to paint Yasser Arafat, then the leader of the PLO, as a front man for Saddam Hussein. And that's what he now does with Hamas and Iran. And then they're all connected to ISIS somehow, just through some spiritual connection. So he's been doing this in the American media and, in public forums in the U.S. for damn near 30 years. And it's for the first time in my life, I'm starting to see opposition to Netanyahu. There is a price to pay for pushing Islamophobia. There's a price to pay for pushing the clash of civilizations. And that price is that you start to lose rank-and-file Democratic Party voters who have been actually the traditional base for pro-Israel support. The Democratic Party has traditionally been much stronger in support of Israel. And you start to lose that because this is a diversifying base. Latinos in the United States, according to every poll I've seen, do not support Israel over the Palestinians. African Americans are deeply divided on this issue. And white liberals are disgusted with Netanyahu because they see him as someone who's attempted to undermine Obama and the Democratic Party. So that's the price to pay. And what we're going to continue to see, and what I've been predicting for the last 2 years, is Israel becoming a wedge issue in elections, much like abortion and gay marriage. If Israel becomes abortion and gay marriage, the bottom drops out on Democratic support for this.
That's fascinating. I've never heard anybody say that. So let's play that forward. 2016 election. Let's assume Hillary is the nominee for the Democratic Party and Jeb Bush is the nominee for the GOP. How would either of those presidencies change or maintain the status quo?
Well, I don't think we should go that far. I think we should talk about the primaries.
Okay.
It's an issue in the Republican primary. It's one of the main issues. And everyone likes to watch the Republican primary because it's like a reality show that of dysfunctional freaks. so each one is competing for Sheldon Adelson's money. They're trying to kiss Sheldon Adelson's ring, and the only way to do that is to compete for who can make the most racist statement about Palestinians and Muslims. This will continue to. This will continue this process we've seen where people outside the increasingly radical right-wing Republican Party connect Israel and racism in their own minds. And it'll turn off Democrats. Then in the Democratic primary, the crisis will deepen. I always talk about this moment at the 2012 convention when there was a voice vote of delegates on adding to the party platform that Jerusalem is the undivided capital of the state of Israel, which means that it should be occupied forever. East Jerusalem should be occupied forever, and the Palestinians should be denied a capital there. And it's also kind of a messianic resolution. And the chairman of the Democratic National Convention was Antonio Villaraigosa, who was the mayor of Los Angeles at the time, and was heavily supported by the Israel lobby because they want to groom Latino leadership and prevent this crisis, prevent a Latino leader from embracing the actual views of his constituents on Palestine. So Villaraigosa held the vote. The nays were twice as loud as the yays. In other words, 2 times as many people in the convention hall were shouting down this resolution in favor of occupation. And Villaraigosa just simply banged the gavel and said the ayes have it, which it was totally undemocratic. Sure. I mean, there was a sound analysis by audio technicians afterwards that showed that 2/3 voted nay in the room. So we're going to continue to see pressure put on the Democrats by the Israel lobby, and Democratic rank and file resist that pressure, and that's going to play out in the primary. I think people in the Democratic Party, far deeper in the party than you or I are, were disgusted that Hillary Clinton 2 days ago held a conference call with Malcolm Hoenlein, who's the head of the Conference of Jewish Presidents, and had Hoenlein issue statements to the media to the effect that she wants to repair relations with Israel that presumably Barack Obama has, destroyed. And we'll hear that kind of tone from Hillary in the election that she wants to improve relations with Israel. She wants to get things back to where they were, bring the special relationship back to.
Well, but what I fear is with Hillary, it's a case of once bitten, twice shy. I mean, when she was the first lady, she criticised Israel's occupation and the building of illegal settlements. But then she was whacked so hard with the AIPAC stick that she's come, not full circle, but certainly, back into the arms of the Israeli lobby.
Hillary Clinton had a meeting with Suha Arafat, who was, I guess, her counterpart for the PLO, the wife of Yasser Arafat. And Suha Arafat complained to Hillary that Israel was using an experimental mint-smelling gas against civilians in the Gaza Strip. And this was used. Hillary didn't respond to that, to my knowledge. And this was used against her when she ran for Senate in New York against Rick Lazio. It turns out that Israel did use a mint-smelling gas against civilians in the Gaza Strip that caused extreme thrashing of limbs. There's footage of victims of this gas, and there's extensive documentation of it. It's pretty easily accessible online. But the point is that she's always going to be confronted with the facts on the ground, and she's going to have to do something about it. And she's going to have to deal with a government in Israel that is that's going to be more right-wing than any government in Israeli history, and that's just the way it's going to be in Israel, because those are the demographics among Israeli Jews. Jewish Israeli opinion is solidly right-wing. It's increasingly anti-American, and the U.S. has no plan beyond a two-state solution. which is off the table now. I mean, Obama has correctly acknowledged that there is no hope for a Palestinian state under the current political dynamics in Israel. So what's Hillary going to do about that? I mean, she's going to campaign in a very pro-Israel fashion. I mean, she's been flying on Haim Saban's VIP jet. He's one of the biggest donors to the Democratic Party and also one of the biggest supporters of Israel. But once she gets in, she has to deal with the facts on the ground. And I don't know what I can't like make any predictions beyond that, and it's not certain that she'll make it in office. I mean, we have to entertain the possibility that Scott Walker, who is being heavily funded by Sheldon Adelson, could be the next president.
What a frightening thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a viable candidate.
Yeah. I mean, this argument, it's between him and I guess Jeb Bush at the moment, and maybe Marco Rubio for the establishment wing and the establishment primary of the Republican Party. And I mean, this guy is a walking, talking stooge for Adelson and the Koch brothers. And that affects the other candidates and how they talk. I mean, Jeb Bush just disowned his father's wise man, James Baker, and has thrown in his lot with the neocons. And that's the Adelson effect. Yeah, I mean, we'll probably end up with a Secretary of State as Josh Bolton. Again, is it Josh Bolton?
John Bolton.
John Bolton.
There's a Josh Bolton.
He's the White House press secretary. Yeah.
But John Bolton, I ran into him at an airport once, and I started talking to him, and he said that if he got into a future administration, he would urge the president to bomb Iran immediately.
Well, he penned an op-ed in the New York Times with words that exact same thing.
Yeah, but this guy's not fooling around.
No,
it's like Dr. Strangelove.
But I wanted to bring the conversation a little bit 180 degrees, and just carrying on what we're talking about before with Netanyahu. Now you've equated Netanyahu with ISIS leader al-Baghdadi, and you've said Israel, and you've also equated Israel with the Islamic State. I sort of wanted you to answer how you see that they're both similar, and also something you said very interesting. And I've always argued, I, along with tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of others, obviously, neocons and new atheists and conservatives live in a symbiotic relationship with Islamic extremism. One says we're at war with the West, and the other one says we're at war with Islam. What I haven't heard from anybody until you said it was that same symbiotic relationship exists between Zionists and anti-Semites. And I just wanted you to talk to that point.
Well, on the first one, I mean, I conceived a hashtag. It first started with me when I spoke in the EU Parliament after the Russell Tribunal, and I referred to Israel as the Jewish state in Israel and the Levant, which is a play on the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. And no one can deny that that's what Israel is. I mean, Israel proclaims itself the Jewish state in Israel and the Levant. So those who challenge or get my designation or get offended by it are denying the existence of the Jewish state. And that, and by when you declare yourself a Jewish state, you, in an area like historic Palestine, which is full of indigenous Muslims and Christians, you are setting the stage for massive atrocities. Just like JSIL ethnically cleanses minorities and indigenous people in order to establish religiously exclusive territory. And just like JSIL has destroyed the heritage sites of those indigenous people in order to kind of recreate this messianic vision of a pure religious order. Just like JSIL claims to speak in the authentic voice of the religion that the state claims to represent, falsely claims to represent. ISIL claims to represent the authentic version of Islam, and that's its appeal to Muslims in the West whom it seeks to recruit. And JSIL claims to speak on behalf of the world's Jews. So it's impossible to challenge Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, which are both inspired by these two horrific entities, without challenging ISIL and JSIL and confronting them. Another point is that both JSIL and ISIL recruit foreign fighters. But in the United States, it's not only legal to participate as a foreign fighter in JSIL and commit atrocities against indigenous people, it's honored. John Kerry said he stands in awe of Max Steinberg, who is a foreign fighter for JSIL who was killed invading the neighborhood of Shujaiya in the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, the U.S. prosecutes anyone who would join up with ISIL in Syria or elsewhere. And so what I'm doing by making these comparisons and by introducing this kind of language is to break through the moral exceptionalism that surrounds Israel, where we see it as a democracy that's just like us, when it is really the moral equal of ISIL, which, by the way, it never confronts militarily, and which it seems to share some kind of actual some kind of actual operational goals with. We've seen Israel treating fighters from the Nusra Brigade in Syria who are affiliated with Al Qaeda, and the only time that we hear Netanyahu criticize ISIS or attack it is to link it to Hamas, which is actually supported by Iran at this point. ISIS is being attacked by Iran, and Netanyahu's campaign is to encourage the U.S. to wage war with Iran while the U.S. is coordinating airstrikes with Iran against ISIS. So I mean, there's a strange kind of de facto partnership that's emerging.
But these de facto partnerships are happening all over the Middle East. I mean, it's in, this is Israel's, Netanyahu's wet dream. What's happening in, the border states all around him is these states are descending into chaos. So therefore, the biggest threat to Israel is pan-Arab nationalism. The Pax Arab identity, that's gone. There's no chance of that ever threatening Israel ever again, like it did in '67. Well, even though even though Israel preempted that war, but you look what's happening in Syria as well. You've got the Assad regime also arming ISIS in some instances to fight the Free Syrian Army. So we're not told this in the Western media. We're just told this simplicity of narrative. Either look all the Muslims are fighting each other again, or the Muslims are trying to destroy Israel and kick them into the sea.
Yeah, Bernard Lewis, who was one of the earliest minds of the neoconservative movement, who was an Orientalist and a professor of Middle East studies at Princeton, who heavily influenced the thinking of Netanyahu, called this phenomenon Lebanonization. And he spoke of it as something that the West should seek to encourage in the Arab world, where civil conflict breaks out, countries are destabilized, and these countries, which were, bulwark Arab nationalist states, reorient themselves around a sectarian model and begin to fragment internally. All of this benefits Israel because the countries around it grow weaker and weaker and begin to fight themselves internally. And then you have Saudi Arabia, which aligns with Israel on every foreign policy question, and which is, bombing Yemen right now. It was so quiet when Israel was bombarding the Gaza Strip and killing, up to over 2,200 people. And now the Saudis are walking around proud like they can beat something other than their maids.
Yeah. What do you think the blowback is going to be to KSA? I mean, the Houthis and the Yemeni, this is going to unite Yemen, number one. Number two, the Houthis aren't as weak as what they're being portrayed in the Western media. And, they share a porous border with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Are we going to see suicide bombings, truck bombings happen in Riyadh anytime soon?
I can't say anything that's like above my pay grade.
Okay.
But it's clear that the Houthis are demonstrating that they're not going to lie down. They just captured a base near Aden, which is like at a strategic maritime crossroads, and Saudis really are not, I think, they don't actually even have a real military. They're basically relying on the Pakistani military in so many ways. So we're looking at a prolonged conflict that's going to just further destabilization in the Gulf. And that's something that the Saudis have been trying to postpone by encouraging destabilization in the Levant. I don't think we've seen the end of the Arab Spring either. The Saudis have just tried to buy off their reckoning with destiny with petrodollars, and that can only last so long.
And Kuwait's doing the same thing, but they're also running out of petrol.
Yeah, but these are our moderate allies. We have to remember that these are the moderate Arab states, and that no matter how many people they behead, as the New York Times reported recently, there's mercy there. I mean, I'm being sarcastic, but I mean, it's interesting, by the way, CJ, that when you listen to the language of Islamophobes like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and others, they very rarely criticize Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
and it's because Saudi aligns with KSA aligns with Western foreign policy, and it aligns with Israel. Their views on religion are kind of pseudo-intellectual cover for a kind of imperial propaganda that has nothing to do with an analysis of theology. They've basically weaponized theology through a really crude, highly accessible format. And that's why I think Islamophobes like Hirsi Ali are so dangerous.
Elaborate on that more, because on the Young Turks network, I said that Sam Harris is dangerous, and I wasn't just talking about him. I was actually, implying that everybody that identifies and parrots this clash of civilizations narrative is dangerous. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on what makes these people dangerous.
Because they provided a very easily digestible, palatable narrative that advances the clash of civilizations, and it appeals to people who are outside the radical right. And that's their goal, is to appeal, for example, from Hirsi Ali's personal story, to appeal to Western liberal feminists, or for Sam Harris to appeal to people who identify themselves as free thinkers. But if you investigate the narrative closely, it's identical to that of John Bolton or Benjamin Netanyahu. And they're urging the same prescriptions to deal with not the Muslim world, but with the entire Middle East. They're not exactly advancing a war on Islam, although that's how they frame their goals. What they're advancing is just imperial conquest and the untrammeled superiority of the West. So the West gets to pretty much re-implement a colonial project across the Middle East through neo-colonial means, and so that's what makes them dangerous, is that they are providing arguments that can be easily repeated by people who identify themselves as liberal or left-wing. I think they've been isolated. I think they've been sufficiently exposed. And, if you look at Sam Harris's background, not a lot of people know that he's sort of a New Age mysticist who actually is religious. I don't know how that fits into atheism. Richard Dawkins has really exposed himself on Twitter. He's committed Twitter side over and over with his comments on Muslims. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali is just sooner or later her story was going to unravel, whether it was me exposing it or someone else. But I just don't see a lot of liberal feminist support for her on this book campaign. I see it being isolated to the right wing. But they've done a lot of damage over the years, and their damage has been in gaining intellectual traction outside of the right-wing hothouse. And finally, they wouldn't have been so dangerous if they weren't supported by mainstream institutions in the U.S. And I'm not just talking about CNN, which likes to have them on, or you know, the American Enterprise Institute, the neoconservative think tank that houses Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I'm talking about, the Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, which has given fellowship to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, basically rewarding her religious bigotry, and which houses her husband, Niall Ferguson. And they just, and now I found out that Bassem Youssef, the Egyptian comedian, is teaching a class at the Kennedy School, which is, kind of the funniest joke I've heard from him in a while. This is a guy who endorsed or supported the coup that overthrew Egypt's elected president, Mohamed Morsi, and he compared the Muslim Brotherhood to Nazis at a time when the Egyptian military was preparing to massacre thousands of them outside Cairo and Rabat.
That's, Egypt. I had Mubin Sheikh on here last week, and he's a former jihadist. He's a CNN contributor, and he wrote the book Undercover Jihadi, and he infiltrated a terrorist cell in Toronto and busted up the Toronto 18, which plotted to execute or behead the Canadian Prime Minister, and we were talking about this, and in these clash of civilization narrative pushes, how they pretend that all these recent incidences have been formed in a vacuum. And I spoke, when I was speaking to him, I spoke, the Muslim Brotherhood is a classic example of that, where they're presented in our media as this radical Islamist group, but we're not told the origin of the group, and the origin being that it's a reaction to the corruption of these, pro-Western governments, which, paid all this money back for the rebuilding of the Suez Canal back to these British banks, and the money went away from infrastructure for Egyptians, and the money was kept at the top with these autocrats. And the Muslim Brotherhood was a populist movement to represent the poor, to get, stuff back, for the downtrodden. But we're not told that. We just present the Muslim Brotherhood to these radical religious fanatics who want to take over the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's just when you have people like Hirsi Ali or Bill Maher, I think Bill Maher might play a much more dangerous role, defining the discussion around Islam. The word Muslim, just the very word Muslim, becomes a dirty word that's associated with terror. When you look at the Muslim Brotherhood in power, they behaved kind of like idiotically. There's no question about that. But in power, the Muslim Brotherhood was signing on to the IMF agenda. The Muslim Brotherhood in power gave the Egyptian army obviously all the power it wanted, and that's what did them in. The Muslim Brotherhood in power negotiated successfully an end to the 2012 military escalation between Israel and the Palestinian factions in Gaza. And it was basically allied with the West. It was not verging very far from the Washington Consensus. So you are looking at a movement that has radical roots, but which was capable of performing like Islamic republicans in power in Cairo. And I think that's why they were seen as so dangerous, because the Camp David Accords basically mandate that a dictatorship be in power in Egypt. I think what we've forgotten about was the scene outside the Israeli embassy in Egypt when the Muslim Brotherhood was in power, when the Arab Spring was in full flight. And the Israeli embassy was besieged, and the walls that surrounded it were torn down. And Flagman, remember Flagman? A guy climbed to the top of the Israeli embassy and hoisted a Palestinian flag. This was like a scene that was really inspiring to Palestinians in the diaspora, because the Egyptian people were acting out their will. They hate Israel. They hate Israel because Israel's repeatedly attacked it, and because Israel slaughters Palestinians. And this was the danger. it wasn't that the Muslim Brotherhood had some kind of terrorist plot to infiltrate the Obama administration. It was that the Camp David Accords, which maintained stability in the Sinai for Israel and helped Israel besiege the Gaza Strip, were slowly unraveling. So we're back to the old model of dictatorship in Egypt. Sisi is probably more pro-Israel than Netanyahu, and he is, I think, one of the main reasons why the war in the Gaza Strip lasted 51 days and killed so many, because it was Morsi and the people around him who pushed on Israel as the negotiator between Hamas and the Israeli government to end assassinations of al-Qassam and Hamas leadership during the November 2012 military escalation. And Sisi explicitly and his people explicitly refused to do this during negotiations in Cairo. So the war just dragged on and on. And there's been, I think, $5.3 billion of aid pledged to rebuild in the Gaza Strip. Only $300,000 of reconstruction aid has reached the Gaza Strip. I mean, the situation is worse than ever. And I really think that the Egyptian junta is just as responsible for this as the Israeli military, as the Israeli government. And just 3 hours ago, Barack Obama, or the White House, released a readout of the meeting the call between Barack Obama and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And Obama pledged to reward Sisi with F-16s, with armored personnel carriers, and with spare parts. So
unbelievable.
Washington has really gotten behind this model of dictatorship, but we're seeing a dictator who's more extreme than Mubarak, and who is probably more pro-Israel than Netanyahu.
And this is what I would argue why these clash of civilizations narrative pushes are so dangerous, is because they keep perpetuating and getting behind these actions which keep fueling radicalization in the Middle East. Like,
Exactly.
and you look at Egypt again. In the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo attack, all these, ridiculous slogan, "We are Charlie" avatars on Twitter, and this hashtag activism, and we've got to get behind France. France is all about free speech. We have to stand up to these Muslims. And 2 weeks after the Charlie Hebdo attack, the French government sells $8 billion of weapons to this Sisi regime, which is the most brutal regime Egypt has probably had in the last 50 years, and slaughtering Muslims en masse. And we wonder where radicalized people come from. I mean, stick your fucking slogan up your ass. You're actually, you're supporting the actions which are fueling this.
Well, Je suis Charlie is just a slogan, a statement of identity. The big Je suis Charlie march was not a march in favor of free speech. It was a march to define the in-group of the real French citizen against the out-group of the Muslims and other assorted non-Charlies. And that's the way that the hashtag has been kind of wielded. And that's the way the French government has behaved. Over 50 people were summoned to police interrogations after the March in Favor of Free Speech for Facebook posts. A kid was arrested for for making noises during a moment of silence for the victims of the Charlie Hebdo massacre. That's ridiculous. But as you said, you can't understand ISIS unless you understand Sisi. You can't understand Baghdadi unless you understand the U.S. torture policy, because Baghdadi was at Camp Bucca, leader of ISIS, and was tortured.
As were 16 of his colleagues.
Alongside 16 colleagues, and this was kind of like their university. This is where it's very similar to the Khmer Rouge being subjected to, fleeing into the hills in Cambodia during the U.S. bombing campaign and sort of going mad in the hills and coming back and exterminating 1/4 of their countrymen. So many of the figures that we associate with global terrorism have been in Egypt's torture chambers or in America's torture chambers. One person I'm thinking of is Ayman Zawahiri, who was tortured in Sadat's chambers when Sadat was throwing Muslim Brotherhood members in his gulags en masse. And then you look at people like Jihadi John, Mohammed Emwazi. He's probably the most notorious terrorist in the world, just because he's the masked face of the ISIS beheading videos. And this is someone who obviously bears full responsibility for his actions and should be punished for them. But he's someone who was arguably driven mad by British security services. When I was recently in London, I went to meet with Cage UK, which is a human rights group that represents a lot of the young Muslim men who find themselves under British security dragnets, who are being surveilled under the British Prevent counter-radicalization strategy, which is being introduced in the U.S. slowly but surely. And Wazi was a young man from East London who was from a rough neighborhood. He had sort of a troubled youth, but he also had a fiancée, and he had a job as a software programmer in Kuwait. He had gone, I think in 2009, to Tanzania, and he said he was going on a safari with some friends at the urging of the British MI6, which is the UK's foreign security service. Emwazi was detained, put in a jail, stripped and put in a really dank jail cell for 24 hours and held at gunpoint by Tanzanian guards. Then he was sent back. I mean, for some reason he was allowed to travel there. He was sent back, and in Amsterdam he was met at the airport by a British MI6 agent who told him that they thought that he was going to Somalia to join al-Shabaab, and that they were going to now make his life hell. They would not allow him to leave the UK. They would not allow. They started to interrogate and harass his fiance's family. They prevented him from taking his job in Kuwait, and they said that your life will continue to be hell until you work for us. In other words, the MI5 and MI6 were trying to recruit Emwazi to spy on other Muslim men in East London. And he refused. He started calling Cage UK. And I met with Asim Qureshi, who fielded Emwazi's phone calls and recorded them. And in the calls, Emwazi described his descent into madness. He told a journalist that Cage attempted to get him in touch with, that he had become suicidal because he was kind of in prison in London. He couldn't leave the country. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't. And his fiance's life was being gradually ruined. So in 2014, I think in the spring of 2014, Emwazi disappeared. He somehow slipped out to Syria. And I don't know how he got out of the country, considering that the MI5 was monitoring his movements. It might have been through a fake passport. But Cage UK believes that was his only way out. He wound up in Syria, and it's not clear why he went to Syria, except that he wanted to probably fight Assad. He wound up in ISIS, and so Cage UK was besieged by the British media, especially by the Tory press that's owned by Rupert Murdoch, and this whole story was suppressed. And I think this story of how Emwazi became who he is really important, just to understand how radicalization works. The standard narrative of radicalization, which is pushed under the British counter-radicalization prevent strategy, and which is being introduced by the White House in the U.S. And the Department of Homeland Security, is it's called the transmission belt, and it centers around the notion that young Muslims adopt first an ideology within their houses of worship and communities that is anti-Western, anti-Israel, and it develops into religious extremism and moves towards terrorist-related action. And so it starts with a kind of ideology that needs to be combated. And so the counter-radicalization strategy focuses on preventing mosques and Islamic community centers from participating in activities like Palestine solidarity, like protesting Israeli wars, and from protesting Western foreign policy, because the belief is that the resentment of the West foreign policy leads to terror. And there's no understanding of how these security dragnets, or how the actual effects of Western foreign policy are. So Cage UK was besieged by the British media as well. They just fell under a sustained attack. They were painted as terrorist sympathizers, and the organizations that had consulted with the British government, like Quilliam, the Quilliam Foundation, on devising the counter-radicalization strategy, which has clearly failed, were the most upset by these revelations about Mwazi, because it showed that radicalization doesn't start necessarily with ideology or with resentment of Western foreign policy, and that its roots are much more complex. And they actually accused Cage UK's staff of participating in pro-Al-Qaeda rallies that they never attended, in order to suppress this entire discussion. So I wrote about this for Alternet and wanted to kind of bring this discussion to the U.S. and kind of problematize the accepted narrative of Muslim radicalization, because the White House has really begun introducing the same kind of prevent counter-radicalization strategy in the U.S. And that's what they did at the recent conference they hosted on radicalization with mainstream Muslim groups.
I've had Dr. Ann Azar-Ali on my show, who's probably one of Australia's leading authorities on combating violent extremism. I've had Moaz and Beg on here, and then last week I had Mubin Sheikh, and all three of them concur with everything that we know about radicalization. And these terrorists or these individuals first have moral, personal, and political grievances. They then later on they turn to scripture. They decide that they're going to make a violent act or revenge against what their injustice that they feel, and then they look for scripture to justify the action that they're about to take or the vengeance. But these culturalists in America, these Orientalists, put it the other way around. They find the scripture, kill the infidels, and then they become radicalized.
Right.
And why we're allowing, why the mainstream media allows these nincompoops to keep, putting it in reverse and getting away with it, just frustrates the hell out of me.
Because it's easier to understand, and it reinforces our own self-image as inherently good because we're Judeo-Christian. Of course, if I would oppose any culturalist explanation of Israel-Palestine from a critic of the Israeli government. In other words, I would reject anyone's argument that Judaism or Jewish scripture is the source of the crisis in Israel-Palestine. And I would accuse them of anti-Semitism, and I've done so because, as we discussed earlier, the roots of the crisis are in settler colonialism. But this works both ways. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are two sides of the same coin.
A lot of Israel's founding fathers were atheists. A lot of the IDF soldiers are atheists. But
I don't even know that Netanyahu believes in God.
There you go. Yeah, that's extraordinary.
There's no evidence that he's anything but an atheist.
Yeah, but yet he'll cry at the Wailing Wall and shed tears because it becomes, their identity rather than a religious, exaltation.
Well, that's the danger of Zionism, is it threatens to redefine what Judaism and Jews are, to the point where they're beginning to welcome non-Jews into their ranks. People like the followers of Pastor John Hagee who wear Jewish talit cloths and wear kippas and blow shofars at their conventions and refer to themselves as Messianic Jews. And they're respected among the pro-Israel community and the Jewish establishment far more than I am. I mean, I don't see any criticism of them for advancing an eschatological end times narrative that's completely anti-Semitic. But I'm constantly attacked in Jewish publications like Tablet to the point where they attempt to they claim that I'm not Jewish at all, and it's simply because I oppose the exclusively Jewish state. It's simply because of that, and so that what they're saying is that not only is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism, but Zionism is Judaism, and that's incredibly dangerous because anyone can be a Zionist.
Oh, well, Norman Finkelstein, his parents were killed in the Holocaust, and he said that it's impossible to call yourself a liberal if you're a supporter of current Israeli policy. And he's been denounced as anti-Semitic. I mean, God, his family exterminated, in the Nazi concentration camps.
Well, it's obviously like gotten. I mean, Norman went through, I think, more than I did because we're living in a time when this anti-Semitism label has been sort of frighteningly sapped of all meaning because it's applied against everyone and their mother. I mean, everyone is accused of anti-Semitism. So my parents were attacked for hosting a book party for me when I published Goliath by the Free Beacon.
Oh my goodness.
It's like, it's just gotten too extreme. But the danger that I'm pointing out is that Zionism seeks to redefine an entire faith group, and that it's distorting and warping the traditions of Judaism. I mean, I point to I think it's the University of South Dakota. It was covered in the Jewish Daily Forward that they have a Hillel house. Hillel is the main Jewish organization on campus. It's the mainstream Jewish organization on campus, and their Hillel house is the members of it, the student members of Hillel. None of them are Jews. They wear, as I said, they wear talit and they participate in Jewish ceremonies, but they're Messianic Jews. In other words, they're evangelical Christians because there just aren't a lot of Jews in South Dakota.
Yeah.
And Hillel has welcomed them and said, that's okay. They've issued no statement against them. But 2 days ago at Muhlenberg College, the president of the Hillel house on campus there was forced to resign in order to host an event with 4 Jewish civil rights veterans who are freedom riders because Hillel House had banned them. They had banned these Jewish civil rights veterans because they were morally consistent and spoke out for the human rights of Palestinians. So that's really what Zionist captivity is doing to the Jewish world. It's so much more dangerous than we realize.
Mate, that's astonishing. Max, we've gone way over time, and I just wanted to ask you one question. As that was on my list of I want to ask you. You've spent so much time. I think you spent a couple 2-year stints or 2 1-year stints in Israel.
Yeah.
And you've obviously spent a lot of time in Gaza. When you hear someone like Bill Maher on his shows justify Israel's military offensive because there's no gay bars in Gaza, what's your response to that?
Well, I don't really think it deserves a response. I mean, I was in Gaza for a week during the war and a week after the war, and I think it's, as my colleague Dan Cohen says, it's the most misunderstood place on earth. And people aren't really interested in this debate over gays or liberalism there. They're basically interested in trying to survive from day to day. They're surplus humanity who's been warehoused. They're living in a human warehouse in a kind of panopticon in conditions that we can't even imagine. And you go there and you meet people who are dealing in the rubble,
Mm.
whose houses have been not only destroyed but defaced by Israeli soldiers with Jewish stars, and they have had their families massacred. You meet children who have no parents just wandering around kind of like ghosts. Um, you meet old people whose entire families have been, you know, have been obliterated, and they greet you with lunch, and they bring you cold water, and they bring you grapes, and they bring you after throwing after ranting about the U.S. arming Israel to do this to them. When you reveal to them that you're American, they bring you sweets and apologize to you for ranting and assure you that they see a clear difference between your government and your people. I think that the integrity of the people I met in Gaza is absolutely peerless, and I've never experienced anything like it. And then beyond that, I meet young people like myself everywhere I go who are secular, who like to drink and have a good time.
Mm.
And their problem isn't with Hamas. It's with the people who are besieging them, who won't let them leave the Gaza Strip so they can take scholarships and be normal. Their problem is would be with people like Bill Maher who are justifying their misery. And I think this issue of pinkwashing is really backfiring, because uh, I just don't I don't know any I
I,
don't know any. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one of Dan Cohen's, Dan's photos. I believe it was one of his. Was taken from the top of this building. I'm not sure which town in Gaza, but the landscape looked like Dresden, in 1944, 1945, and there's a solitary figure sitting on the top of this bombed-out building, and I put a tweet. Bill Mayer wants to know why there's no gay bars here. I mean, that's just
Well,
there's,
I mean, just imagine, from the perspective of a queer person, seeing your identity and your oppression instrumentalized to justify the oppression of another group of people, who are going through hell. I mean, that is going to throw you into some kind of, if not curiosity about what's happening to Palestinians, then full-fledged activism. And when I meet non-Palestinians who are involved in Palestine solidarity activism, they're disproportionately queer. And it's because they have had to deal with a sense of being left out, excluded, and oppressed from a very young age, from even within their own families. That's particularly true within Jewish Israeli society. So many of the radical anti-occupation activists I meet in Jewish Israeli society, and there's like less than 1,000 of them, who are active on a day-to-day basis, are queer. And so I think, like, the more Bill Maher wants to advance to advance pinkwashing, the more the Israel lobby wants to embrace pinkwashing, the better, because it's just going to backfire. And I think that they can only buy so much time.
Mm.
They can't bomb their way out of their problems anymore. They
Can't kill
can't
your way to
argue their
victory.
way.
Yeah.
They can't argue their way out of their problems anymore, and they're just going to have to. They're just going to have to deal with the fact that someday there's going to be a reckoning, and I hope that reckoning will be something along the lines of the kind that the apartheid government in South Africa witnessed, and not the kind that the French colonial project in Algeria went through.
Mm. Absolutely, mate. Well, mate, it's been a great conversation, Max. And as I said off air, when I first made the decision to launch a podcast, I drew up a list of targets, and you were certainly at the very top of that. And mate, it's been awesome having you on here. I know you've got a new book coming out, the 51-Day War, about last summer's siege of Gaza.
Yeah.
Definitely want to have you back on here when that book is out, and we can talk about that.
Well, this is the first time I've enjoyed being targeted, so let's do it again.
For sure, buddy. All right, mate. And the best place, everybody knows, most of my guests are going to be familiar with your work, but where's the best place to find you, find your current books? Goliath, is that on Amazon?
Well, you can get Goliath at Amazon or Powell's Books if you want to support an independent bookseller. And the 51 Day War can be pre-ordered at Amazon, or just Google it and you'll find lots of independent booksellers as well. And you can follow me on Twitter at Max Blumenthal.
Right on, buddy. All right, mate. Thanks, Max, and I'll see you on Twitter, and the war continues.
Thank you.
All
Good
right,
talking to you.
see you too, buddy. Thanks, mate.